This is Jennifer Gonzalez welcoming you to episode 187 of the Cult of Pedagogy podcast. In this episode, we'll be talking about a strategy for deepening students' understanding called contrasting cases. Critical thinking is one of those habits many of us say we want schools to nurture in students, something an educated person should have in their toolbox and use frequently when encountering the world. But the term itself is kind of a broad, nebulous thing. The phrase critical thinking isn't something you see frequently in standardized curricula, and I think that's because it's more of an umbrella term that applies to more specific, observable activities. So, teaching critical thinking can look a lot of different ways when we practice it in the classroom. In today's episode, we're going to look at one of those ways, a strategy you can use to get your students thinking critically about the content you teach. My guest, Sarah Levine, is an education professor at Stanford who is appearing on the podcast for the second time. The first was in episode 162, where she talked about a fantastic strategy for responding to literature called Up, Down, Both, Why. Today, she's sharing another strategy, one that not only allows students to look critically at texts, but that can also be applied to other content areas. The strategy is called contrasting cases. The basic gist of it is that if we want students to understand something deeply, we'll get them there a lot more effectively if we show them contrasting examples of that thing. Learning how to not just take some artifact at face value, but to also study other artifacts that share some things in common, but also veer from the original in important ways, is a skill students can apply in many ways, not just in our classrooms, but throughout their lives as learners and thinkers. In this episode, Sarah is going to show us some different variations for how the contrasting cases strategy can be used. Once you hear these examples, you'll be able to take them into your classroom and use them right away. Before we get started, I would like to thank Text Help for sponsoring this episode. Understanding and being understood is vital for all of us. When we understand, we are more confident and more likely to succeed. But everyone's brain works differently. We don't all read, write, and think in the same way. The average reading age is lower than you'd expect. Millions have dyslexia, and huge numbers of people just struggle with text in some way. The folks at Text Help believe that everyone deserves to understand and be understood. Their tools help to make school and university more inclusive and set all students up for the best possible start in life. Read and Write is their literacy support toolbar that offers help with everyday tasks like reading text out loud, understanding unfamiliar words, researching assignments, and proofing written work. And the best part is, Read and Write is free for teachers. Get your copy at text.help/pedagogy. Text Help products have already helped millions of people, and they're ready to help millions more. Support also comes from ListenWise, providing short, high-quality, age-appropriate podcasts for grades 2 through 12. Save time with pre-made lessons designed to build students' background knowledge and academic vocabulary. Keep students on grade level with scaffolding and differentiation. It's great practice for meeting listening and speaking standards. With ListenWise Premium, you get comprehension tools like quizzes, interactive transcripts, text-to-speech toolbar with Spanish translations, graphic organizers, and more. It's perfect for English language learners. Sign up for free at listenwise.com. Now, here's my interview with Sarah Levine about contrasting cases. All right, for the second time, I am happy to welcome Sarah Levine back to the podcast. Hi, Sarah.
Hi.
Hi.
Good to see
So
you.
we're talking about, you came on last time and talked about a really cool strategy, and you're back for a different one. And so before we get into this, for anybody that didn't listen to episode 162, where we talked about Up, Down, Both, Why, just tell us a little bit about what you do in education.
I am on the faculty at the Graduate School of Education at Stanford University, and I work on mostly focus on English language arts education, helping students and teachers, and I particularly focus on literary interpretation. But today, the approach that we're talking about is kind of bigger than ELA. It works across subject areas.
Yes,
So I'm
absolutely.
branching out a little bit. So you'll have to help me, when we head outside the ELA world.
Yeah, we decided to add a couple of other examples for that. So what we're going to talk about today is this strategy called contrasting cases. So before we get into all the different examples, just give us an overview of what this strategy is.
The idea with this strategy is that um, it's really difficult to think about what a thing means, to define a thing, to interpret a thing when you're only thinking about that one thing. We, all of us in our heads, have a whole bunch of different connecting ideas. Psychologists call them schema,
Hmm.
that help us differentiate between different things. And we use those schema when we're trying to define or talk about things. So, for example, right here in this post, you'll see there's a color green at the top of this post.
Hmm.
And if I just look at this and you ask me what it is, I say green.
Right.
But when you compare this green with a bunch of other greens, now I can get more specific and say it's dark green, it's forest green, it's emerald green. But I can really only do that because I've got these comparisons to use to kind of bounce off of. And
Right.
that's true for, is really how we think. This is,
Hmm.
and one of the things I know I do in the classroom, sometimes I forget that, and then I ask kids, what's the deeper meaning here, or what do you think the author's saying, or how would you define X? And that's really hard to do on your own. But if you
Right.
say compare X to Y, now how do you define X?
Hmm.
That's much easier.
Right. And so what you're going to be talking with us about, and you got a blog post about this too, is that by presenting these different examples to students, showing them the different greens, for example, you can elicit much deeper thinking from them and
That's right.
analysis as opposed to just, showing them the one thing.
Yep, that's right. And the same, Jen, goes for something like, here's a model paper. Take a look at it. Let's figure out. Here's a college essay. What are all the things a college essay should have? That's really hard. But
Mm,
comparing 5 college essays and asking kids to find the common features across those 5 essays, now I can identify what a college essay should have.
right. This reminds me so much of concept attainment, which is another inductive learning type of a strategy where you have to look at a lot of examples and then you can generalize
That's right. And the
from
reason
there.
we teachers, I think, often forget that is because we already have a bunch of them in our heads. We
Right.
forget that our kids don't.
Yeah, yeah. So this is a strategy that teachers can use in a lot of different areas. And so the examples that you're going to be really drilling down into today are specific to language study. But what we did is we looked for other examples in other subject areas, and it comes up in a lot of places.
That's right.
So, when you initially came to me, it was as a language arts person. So I said, why don't I go and see if this comes up anyplace else? And so I did find a couple of other things. One is in language arts, which still is kind of related, which is in writing instruction. And this is something I remember as an English teacher too, is having students look at different examples at different levels of proficiency. And I did find research behind the practice that I had experienced also, which is that it actually helped students build a better sense of what good writing looks like, and it improved their writing by looking at these different levels versus just looking at good writing.
That's right.
Looking at the different levels helped them refine that. Um,
Right. And of course, you as the teacher have to define what you think good writing is, or what the particular features you want students to focus on when they're comparing.
yes, yes, actually giving them a keener eye, I guess, for what they're even looking for to begin with. So apparently, contrasting cases comes up a lot in math. Having students compare two or more ways of solving a problem improves their procedural knowledge and their problem solving flexibility. And when I was looking up contrasting cases, that was the discipline that it came up the most in,
Yeah.
was in math. Was, here's a problem, here's how two or three different people solved it. Let's talk about this and talk about why. And like you were just saying, the teacher does need to sort of like design that conversation better than just kind of throwing it out there.
Right. It's not any three examples. It's three examples that are going to help kids understand the underlying features of the problem, or look at particular kinds of, detours that a kid might make that might not make sense for them.
Right. And this is something that we're seeing too in the research, is that choosing the right examples has a lot to
Yes.
do with the effectiveness of it. So, and it also came up in science, in organic chemistry and in physics. Having students compare structures gave them a lot deeper understanding of the conceptual knowledge, as opposed to just looking at surface features of things. It gave them a much more a stronger ability to generalize, as
Yep.
opposed to just sort of a Venn diagram of similarities and differences.
Yep. 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 Yep.
So, and the part that you're going to be really exploring in depth is three specific adaptations of contrasting cases for studying language.
Yep.
So let's get
Okay.
started with those. So what's the first one?
So the first is the easiest. Easiest for you, easiest for your kids, and that is just a continuum or a scale of carefully chosen synonyms that will help your kids understand and build connotation. So
Mm-hmm.
it's really designed to help kids see associations, connotations, symbolic value. And this is especially useful when you're looking at political rhetoric. That's
Mm-hmm.
where I use it the most when it comes to these synonyms. So, for example, um, I think we all have been thinking a lot about climate change.
Mm-hmm.
And when you're studying language, one of the things you're looking at is how people are presenting the idea of climate change and what language they're using to frame climate change. So uh, you want your kids to pay attention to this, but if you were to simply ask them, what are the effects of the term climate change? How do you think, audiences understand that? Or what are the effects of the term global warming? Your kids will often struggle because they don't have the schema, all of the different examples in their heads that you have in yours. You know that there's also global heating, or there's also climate crisis or climate emergency, and you know that different um, people present this term in different ways. So if you simply say to them, talk about global warming, what are the effects? You're going to probably get more surface feature responses like, well, it really makes it sound like the earth is warming or the
Mm-hmm.
globe is getting warm,
Mm-hmm.
which is true.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but what you want to do is provide them with a set of comparisons that will allow them to make use of what they already know to be true about language, which is that it does have associations and positive and negative connotations. So, what you'd want to do, um, if you're interested, for example, in having your kids explore the different rhetoric behind climate change, is look for a bunch of synonyms that will highlight the different kind of dramatic ways that people can present climate change, both, if you will, on the left and the right.
Mm-hmm.
So that would mean climate change and also extreme weather and climate arson. That's one that my daughter likes to use a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, when kids have 5 or 6 different examples of different kind of rhetorical extremes, they can then better see and articulate the effects of something like global warming.
Right. So you have students sort of look at, a bunch of synonyms for, a different word. And then what do they do next? Or what can you do as a teacher with those?
Well, one thing I often go to is a kind of a positive and negative scale.
Mm-hmm.
And that's because that's just another kind of contrasting case. It gives kids an anchor to think about, does this thing seem more positive or more negative? So if you
Mm-hmm.
were to ask your kids to put global warming on a scale, a continuum between positive and negative of effects, positive and negative effects for different audiences, they could then, in small groups, argue with one another about whether global warming seems more optimistic, more
Mm-hmm.
comforting, more alarming, let's say, than extreme weather or climate change or climate arson. And
Mm-hmm.
then when they are reading about these things in other texts, it's easier for you then to say, let's take a look at the term that this author is using here. um, what do you think the effects are, for different audiences? Because they've
Right.
got that scale in their mind. They have those contrasting cases in their mind.
Yeah. I would think this would also really impact them as writers then. You have kids sometimes will just go straight to a thesaurus and randomly choose a word.
Right.
It's like, that does not mean what you think it means.
Right, right,
And
right, right.
so
Yes.
this kind of thinking should transfer over to their writing too.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, obviously, you have to be purposeful about that too. So
Hmm.
I actually really like using the thesaurus function
Hmm.
in Google or on a Word doc to say, here's six.
Right.
They all have kind of different meanings. Let's put them on a scale. And
Hmm.
which one do you really want to use? Now, half the time they'll be like, I don't really care. I just want to
Right.
get this assignment done. But if the assignment, if they're speaking to someone they care about, then yes, the word matters and they're going to care
Hmm.
about that word.
Hmm. Absolutely. And so, what are some other ways that this idea of synonyms can play out in terms of other kinds of studies?
Well, I think, as I was saying, one of the things I like to use most when it comes to these synonym scales is thinking about power,
Mm,
race, and language. So if you were to compare, and your kids are here, you're drawing on their everyday knowledge and
right.
skills, woman versus, lady versus chica versus chick. Um,
Mm-hmm.
what would you prefer to be called and why?
Mm-hmm.
When you're doing that, when you're comparing those terms, you're helping kids develop the skills to interpret the connotations of a word
Mm-hmm.
or to build the
Mm-hmm.
connotations of that word. And that's at the heart of, anything that you want to do with language beyond summary. So any
Right.
kind of scale where kids are practicing saying this word has the effect of, or this
Mm-hmm.
word connotes,
Mm-hmm.
is getting them towards the kind of interpretive thinking that you want them to do.
Right. And so this could also work in terms of, you had expanded it in the post beyond just simple words, that it can go to whole pieces that sort of represent the same idea or the same text.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. And that's the key is for contrasting cases, when you're getting beyond specific words or phrases, is that you want to think about the features of a particular thing that you want to highlight. Like, for example, let's say you're looking at college essays
Mm.
because you're doing a unit because that's because you're a good person and you're trying to help your kids. So you don't want to just slam down any five examples of college essays to help them understand how college essays work. You want to choose, for example, let's say you're interested in helping kids see the effect of painting a picture.
Mm-hmm.
So, in telling a story. So, you'd
Mm.
want to either find on the internet, tweak, choose, write. I'm all over the place, looking in the garbage, wherever it is that you're looking
Mm.
for college essays that have different versions of painting pictures with narrative. So
Okay.
some are going to use, boring verbs and not a lot of detail. Some are going to use great verbs. Some are going to have too many adverbs.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the thing you're going to focus on. That's the feature you want. You give kids, three or four examples of, it could just be a paragraph
Yeah.
of different ways of sharing the same story
Mm-hmm.
and have them think about which are most effective and why.
Right.
And it's just far more effective than giving them one and saying, look at all of the great verbs that they're using here. This is really how you can get people to hear and taste and smell and see what you do. No, give them several examples so they can see the effect for themselves because they're
Mm.
comparing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Once it's, yeah. This actually kind of reminds me of an example that you have coming later. But yeah, once they can see the contrast, it's really was what makes things stand out.
Right. And
Um,
again, not to to repeat too much, but we as teachers are already doing that because we've seen literally thousands of college essays. They
okay.
haven't. So the one example we give them does not do the job. They
Right.
need to see and compare more.
Right. That's how, I mean, that is how a person develops a sophisticated understanding of things. It's years and years of exposure to different examples. And yeah, they don't have that.
Exactly.
Um, I think this also is, when I think about kids and academic writing, they just don't see it enough. So no, it's no wonder they can't do it. And I think their early attempts end up being almost duplicates of the examples they see until they've seen a lot of examples, and then they can develop their own style.
Right, and the duplicates that they often create, don't sound quite right because they're working
Hmm.
with, a kind of discourse that's just not familiar to them. Um, so yeah, the more comparisons they can see, and how kids love to judge. So the more times they're able to be like, this doesn't work, this is way better. The better off
Yeah.
you are, the better off they are. And
Right.
sometimes it will happen that a kid will say, I actually like this one that you were thinking was a bad example or a non-example,
Right.
better than this one, the one that you were really into and hoping they would all like. And that's also okay because that gives you an opportunity to say, well, why is that? And you're allowed then to say, oh, I totally see what you're saying. But, I got to say, as a reader, for me, the one without all the adverbs and the one with the
Hmm.
strong verbs really is more effective. What do the rest of you think?
Yeah. Yeah.
So
That's
don't be
great.
freaked out if a kid takes the example you chose as the worst and holds it up as the best. That's
That's
still,
happened to me before.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
But it's an opportunity for you to talk about it, to have other kids be like, oh, I don't see that. And for you personally to say, wow, that's not the way I see it.
Mm-hmm.
If a thing that we kind of didn't talk about just now was when we were talking about language and power, was talking about news headlines. And those are also a really useful way across many subject areas of looking at the power of language. You're looking at headlines that are describing the same thing,
Mm-hmm.
but they're using different language to do it. That's a perfect way to use contrasting cases to have kids think about the effects of different verbs, the effects of different syntax, the effects of different political biases.
Right. And we're actually in the post, we're going to link to a website that's called allsides.com, which does that for you. That's their job at that site, is to pull three news articles for every topic. And one is from the far left, one's from the far right. And we're linking to one that's about the don't say gay bill in Florida, and the difference in those headlines. It's like they made it for us as the
Yeah,
example. They're
that's
that
right.
starkly different.
Yeah, it's
Um,
upsettingly different. Now, some of them
yeah.
I will say on that website, some of them are awesome. Some of them, the differences aren't uh, clear enough, or they don't do enough that you wouldn't necessarily want to use them. But the example that
Yeah.
you pulled is terrific.
Yeah, yeah. And sometimes it's even in the article too. There are certain words that are chosen to describe specific pieces of that news story that really are like, that's very, very different.
Yep, yep, yep.
Let's just touch also on this little piece about world languages, about translations, because I think
Yeah,
that's really interesting for anybody who's doing a language. That's another. I mean, different works throughout history have been translated by different people, and they can come out extremely different. And so that's something that can be done in language classes also.
that's right. In language classes or in any class where you've got a lot of multilingual students.
Hmm.
So you could be looking at, I've done this in my ELA classes when I have a lot of Spanish speaking students. We look at several English translations of a Spanish language poem, and the monolingual students can compare the English translations and talk about what seems sadder, or what seems more cheesy, what's more effective, what hits
Mm,
them. The multilingual students can actually look at the translations and say, I don't think that this verb actually captures, that's not really what this verb means. Here's the verb
mm,
that I would use. So
hmm.
it's valuable for a bunch of reasons, even if you're not in a world language or a second
Right.
language classroom.
What a nice way to really honor those students who speak that language as their first language, to honor that expertise and really bring in their. I don't think that's the kind of thing that happens often enough in U.S. schools anyway, or maybe it is happening more often, but that's a
Oh,
real
yeah.
nuanced conversation.
And it feels so good. It feels so good for them to be able to say, that's not right. You know,
Right. Okay, so that was the first one, is the synonyms and putting synonyms on a scale. So the second one you've got is called there and not there.
yes. And I mean, these are all just basic versions of comparing, or rather
Mm-hmm.
contrasting. And just so we
Mm-hmm.
know, I use compare and contrast interchangeably. I
Yeah.
guess compare, you're looking for the same stuff, and contrasting, you're looking for the different stuff. So I guess they're
Yeah.
not the
It's
same. But
always
anyway,
felt like kind of a pointless distinction between those two. Yeah.
yeah. So there and not there, just another way of highlighting specific features that you want kids to think about, just not by pointing at them and saying, what are the effects, but instead having kids learn. And this is something they can learn to do on their own, to simply look at a feature and then take it away and
Mm,
see what's left and what are the differences in the effects of whatever that text is. So here we've got, on the blog, we've got an example of Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech, and there's so much to look at there in terms of rhetorical power. One of the things people often talk about is the repetition, um, that Dr. King uses.
right.
And it's really hard when you're talking to a student. It's really hard for them to say, oh, the repetition does X, Y, and Z. And in fact, even if you ask yourself, as an experienced reader, what's the repetition doing? You end up saying things like, well, it really hammers it home, or it makes you think
Hmm.
about it, because it's just hard to articulate what this rhetorical tool is doing. But if you take the tool away, so if you've got but 100 years later, which King repeats several times, in the space of, 50 words,
Mm-hmm.
get rid of that repetition and just have it once,
Mm-hmm.
and ask your kids, give it a shot. Ask your kids, what are the effects when the thing is gone and when the thing is there? And you can give them scales. Does it seem more effective, less effective, more sad, less sad? Uh, what's it doing? What's lost, I guess, is a way to say it.
Mm-hmm.
What is lost when you take this thing away?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
as always, there'll be at least one kid who's like, it's better,
Right.
it's shorter.
It's
Uh,
done quicker.
yeah, you get through it
Yeah.
quicker. But it activates kids' schemata and help them understand the effects of rhetoric, which you just
Right.
can't do when you're looking at the one thing.
Yeah. And I would also think that for a lot of kids, they never really had to think about it and realize somebody actually had to write that and choose to repeat that over and over. It's a decision as a writer that you can make.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
So, okay, so we've got there and not there. And then the third approach is called bare bones versus dressed up.
Yeah, and it's kind of like there and not there.
Mm-hmm.
But oftentimes I think about this a lot when I'm reading novels with my
Mm-hmm.
kids. And when I'm looking at the state exams, which want you to identify, quote, the central idea in a
Yeah.
text, or when you're thinking to yourself, okay, what's the big message? What's the big theme? I need the kids to take away this big idea. I get frustrated, because then I think, like, well, what's the point of writing the whole damn book? Why not just, you know,
Yeah.
of Mice and Men? Boy, it's really hard to be poor in the Depression.
Yeah.
Why not just have that and skip the story?
Yeah.
So we know that's not the point.
Right.
The point of reading this book is not to take away that one message, because if that were the case, you would simply read the message.
Right.
But a valuable thing to do to help kids kind of explore what the actual narrative is doing, or what the language is doing, is to just boil the thing down to its essence.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's really hard to be poor in the Depression,
Mm-hmm.
and then start adding in all of the stuff that the author added in. um, all right, so why not just say it's really hard to be poor in the Depression? Why add this character and this character? How does
Mm.
that help communicate
Mm-hmm.
this message?
Mm-hmm.
I've done an example here in the blog with Beloved by Toni Morrison,
Mm-hmm.
um, which allows you to think about, for example, what is this house with the address 124 adding to these
Mm.
big ideas about
Mm-hmm.
slavery, about enslavement, about being haunted, about guilt, about agency, all of that stuff? What's this house have to do with it? And if you took it away from the story, this is a there and not there,
Right.
what would be lost? Or now
Right.
we're just going to build. We're going to build for example, with a college essay, really all you're saying is just take me.
Yeah. Yeah.
But you've got to write this whole narrative. So since every single college essay is saying, just take me, what are the differences in the ways people express that message? And how does each edition, how does each dressing up of that essential message, how does those things affect the readers
Right.
or affect the readers?
Right. Right. So we've looked at three sort of different applications of this idea. There's lots of different ways of doing it. So I guess before we finish up, what would be like the big takeaways from this? What should teachers keep in mind as they're using this
Yeah.
strategy?
The things that I try to remember for myself are number one, 3 is better than 1.
Mm,
One example does not often do the job.
okay.
3 examples that are similar in, let's say, content, but different in style,
Mm-hmm.
that does the job.
Mm-hmm.
So 1 is not enough.
Mm-hmm.
And then the second thing is when you're creating contrasting cases, you need to be purposeful. You need to think about the features you want to highlight
Mm-hmm.
and then either find or create or tweak contrasting cases that will allow kids to see that particular feature. Let's say
Mm-hmm.
it's syntax. That means you're going to have one college essay with a lot of long sentences, one college essay with a bunch of short sentences.
Mm,
That is the way they understand the effect of different sentence structure as opposed to simply one model.
right.
And then the second big takeaway is if you want your kids to understand the basic features of a thing, like
Mm,
what does an essay have in it,
mm-hmm.
instead of giving them the list of things an essay has in it or giving them one essay and saying, what does this essay have to have? Give them a bunch.
Right.
Instead of you telling them, have them compare and discover that all essays seem to have a thesis. All essays seem to have a bunch of evidence.
Yeah.
Having them compare will have them better identify, articulate, and remember the common features across a bunch of contrasting cases. And then the third takeaway is help them learn to do this for themselves so that when they are out of
Mm,
your class and they're like, oh crap, I got to write a cover letter. I've never done that before.
yeah.
I'm going to go look at 10, see
Yes.
what the common features are, and then I'm going to try to write one, not just one, but 10.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, because you just never know what example you might stumble on that could lead you astray.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion. Um, Sarah, where can people find you online if they wanted to reach out?
My Twitter handle is at S_R_Levine. And you can find me on the Stanford Graduate School of Education website, where I've got a couple of resources that might be useful for teachers.
Awesome. And we'll link to that in your post too.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Thanks for sharing this. You have some really great ideas that are going to help a lot of teachers.
Yeah, this is really fun. Thanks. I appreciate it.
To read Sarah's blog post about this strategy, including links to resources and research to support it, visit cultofpedagogy.com, click podcast, and choose episode 187. To get a bi-monthly email from me about my newest blog posts, podcast episodes, courses, and products, sign up for my mailing list at cultofpedagogy.com/subscribe. Thanks so much for listening and have a great day.